Hi, and welcome back to the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at eu.vc. This is a special episode recorded on the snowy mountains of Villars-sur-Ollon during the Villars Institute Summit, where we had the pleasure to talk to Rokas, founder and managing partner of Contrarian Ventures, a seed-stage VC mobilising resources for climate action in Europe and Israel with a founders-first approach. And Christian, co-founder and partner of 2150 VC, a venture capital firm investing in technology companies that seek to sustainably reimagine and reshape the urban environment. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the follow button, giving us a review, and following the European VC on LinkedIn.
Welcome to the European VC podcast. This is a special episode. We're here at Villars-sur-Ollon. So I think the first obvious question or kind of thing we should talk about is, why are you guys here, right? Who are you? Of course, give us the quick intro, but why are you guys here? What are you doing here today?
Hey, so I'm Rokas. I'm one of the founders and managing partners of Contrarian Ventures. We're a climate-focused venture capital firm, which is trying to back the next generation of entrepreneurs, building what we believe is the biggest generational shift from commodity of choice of oil and gas to commodity of choice being electron. And we do that earliest stages when these companies just forming. So we're here to discuss and get our act together and do things that enable this transition to be faster. And I think we'll discuss plenty of things during today's chat with you guys.
Yeah, I'm Christian. I'm one of the founders of 2150. We're a global venture capital fund focused on how you reshape and imagine the urban environment to essentially decarbonize it and fight climate change. We focus on Series A and B, raised $300 million in our Fund 1. And we look for what we call gigacorns, so companies that can reduce 1 gigaton of CO2, as well as looking at some of the other categories like biodiversity, which we also believe is essential in climate change. I joined this setup here in the beautiful mountains of Swiss, basically because I think the right people are here, right? And for us to create a movement where we mobilize enough capital, where we get the right discussions around how we change policy and get the solution forward, we need to come together. We'd obviously have picked another location, but this is not too shabby.
Not too bad. To our listeners, we have episodes with Contrarian and 2150 already on the podcast. So if they want a deep dive on the funds, I think that's also a really interesting invitation there. But let me ask, this is not a tech conference, right, per se. This is not a VC conference. This is not a typical event where we go and it's only VCs and we're all having fun and getting drunk and stuff. So I think there's a good question to ask and to start with, which is, what is our role as an industry venture, right, in an event like this? Because there's a lot of stakeholders here represented, which is awesome, right? Great opportunity. It's also somewhat of a challenge, I find. So what do you guys think?
I think what the organizers of the Villars Summit are trying to do is sort of bring a very diverse group of people to talk about a very complex topic and bring different perspectives. And I think, this is a perfect setting for that. It represents different countries around the world, from Australia, Africa, LATAM, US, in a place that is very neutral for that type of discussion, which tends to be Switzerland, generally for years, right? And Davos is an equivalent example for like the global leaders of what we call probably traditional businesses and politicians. I think this is a very different setup in the sense that it's trying to bring people that care about the topic matter. So it's not about like some sort of power move. It's not about, different things of trying to do deals, but it's about having that discussion. Obviously, discussion is not enough, and probably we're very rational as venture capitalists. We like actions, and we like actions that are measured and that can be quantified. So I think this is the first gen of it, so call it the OG version probably of the summit, and hopefully this evolves into something that is beyond just the discussion, but to some sort of sensible action. But I think it's a great setup in this beautiful hotel with a very sensible purpose where this could go. And obviously people make it where it could go. So I think it's just a very interesting point of time as well that we are at.
If you look at venture going maybe back 10, 20 years, at least that's how I look at it, it's been partly a closed community, right? An ecosystem, a network. I think when you look at the problems we're facing the next 25 years, 50 years, venture will play a different role and probably be having the most relevant decade ever. Because when you essentially look at the problems that we're facing in the world, we need venture of two reasons. First of all, is bringing new innovation. So taking great ideas, turning them into amazing companies and solutions that actually solves a problem, right? And when you look at climate change, we fundamentally need real solutions which are science-backed and so on. So I think venture capital has a huge role to play in terms of science and innovation. And secondly, I think also the fact that when you look at our constraint in terms of solving climate change, time is our biggest constraint, right? What is amazing about the venture capital industry, and we saw it last week, unfortunately, in a bad shape, where you probably saw the fastest, digital bank run ever, because you mobilized a piece of the economy and the society who could work really fast and really move fast, right? And the same goes with when you need to, scale solutions in an exponential way to actually break that time constraint. That's where venture is really, really strong, right? It can create exponential effects, and that actually gives hope, right? Because if we 10 years from now want to, be in a much better place in terms of climate change, we need something that scales fast.
I'd love to bring up a topic that we discussed last night over the dinner table, which is what you might call VC for the last 10 years versus VC as what it's coming to be. Because my feeling, especially, of course, from talking to the two of you, is that you have a belief that VC will go more towards what we could all call the real problems rather than just the next Twitter or the next whatever social media.
Not that it is not important, by the way.
Exactly.
No, we all love 140 characters and what you can do with that. But I'd love to ask you, how do you see that change happening? And also, what do you kind of see coming for the next 5 years?
I think when you look back, right, VC has done great things from when it started with semiconductors into, globalizing media and, creating connections across people.
Bringing people
delivering
closer.
goods. Yeah, exactly. And so I think we should not think of VC as not being something which has not been really good for society in the past. But I just think you need to change your mindset and think, how does it need to change to solve the problems that we are having ahead of us, right? So some of the discussions around how do we scale, more hardware companies and so on, these conversations we've not had in the past, where maybe policy plays a bigger role, a different type of capital. So I think it's not to say that venture has not been good in the past. It's more like we need to think differently, because history won't repeat, right? And we need to invent together the new solutions for the future and the new setups. And I think that will also change how venture capital funds will operate in the future.
I think we just had a super nice walk with one of the guys who was doing a panel and sort of teaching about telling stories. And I think ventures got good, very good entrepreneurs got very good, especially in the Valley, to tell stories and amplify them, and in the good outcomes and the bad outcomes equally, right? We had obviously some misconceptions where people were misperceived to be dragged into something that necessarily did not work, and that was probably outright lie. But I think the climate problem is so complex that in order to amplify that message simply is very tough to do. So why VCs did not look or underlook this category, for example, I'm not referring just to climate tech. I'm referring broadly to like the tough tech and hardware, however you want to call it. It was just because the message conveyed to the VC was not what they wanted to hear. And a lot of these entrepreneurs are great scientists, they have great IP, but you just present the stuff with a high complexity, which implied very hard outcome for the capital allocator. So that's one bit. And I think communication is one of the most crucial things for especially hardware companies, because they by design need to attract vast amount of capital, and that someone that is allocating the capital needs to invest into that to be a huge outcome for both financial and both also from the impact side of things. And then maybe one thing that we discussed, and that's something that I read, and it's a brilliant, and maybe I can share you guys the link. There was something that climate as topic has so many names. There are people that call it sustainability, there are people that call it impact. The climate change itself is called global warming. Initially it started, then it was climate change. And I stumbled upon the report which said it's not actually a change, because change means it could be for a good or for a bad, right? It's actually, we're pretty much perceived as climate worsening. So like, this is the best outcome. It's gonna be just worse. And it will be worse. It could, in some places, temperature will increase, in some temperature will decrease. It's not about the warming of the planet only. It's actually about completely destructing biodiversity in places where it was stale or stable for a long periods of time, right? And that is an interesting concept as well. And COVID sort of showed people when it touches directly or your family, you get to get your shit together and do something about it, right? Or there's a war in Ukraine, people like really start to get the shit together, right? Like climate is something that you don't see with your visible eye, but that worsening is coming every single day. And like what Christian alluded, like the timing element is so crucial, because every single day you lose to it, you're not bringing solution, not bringing capital to the right point, we're just basically losing an opportunity cost. Like this opportunity cost is just so significant, and it's accelerating every step and every day, right? So like, I feel like the resources that we have today from a capital perspective are non-constrained. They're just not understanding the problem as it is.
Yeah, and I think, we need to think of this as a change into a stakeholder model from maybe a shareholder model, right? And if you think of it, we are the first generation to be able to tackle climate change, and the last one who can save the planet and human civilization from it, right? Which is pretty crazy to think of, right? We lived 1,000 years in nature, 200 years in cities, and we have 10 years to change how we, build and imagine cities and our whole energy infrastructure. The good thing about, thinking about how it can change the world is when you look back to venture, it's actually created, massive amounts of jobs and productivity and so on. And as we talked about at dinner last night, it's become more expensive to buy a home, but it's been cheaper to buy a phone and a flat screen, and the product has become better. Why don't we change the way that we do cities and how we do energy infrastructure and so on? We need to change our mindset and go to a stakeholder model.
It's funny because I heard you say that yesterday as well, and I couldn't help but see some echoing of what you've also seen Mark Andreessen put out in his writings. But nonetheless, A16Z kind of been speaking a lot about the built environment as well, or at least it's time to build. But it's kind of like we're still seeing them doing what you might call traditional VC or blockchain stuff and that kind of thing.
They bought into biotech.
Yeah, and I think also they just, financed Adam Newman with $325 million on try to, create a modular construction setup. We have a company called Neighbor, which started a few years ago. Amazing team, amazing product, which is tackling the same issue. And I think you need to think of, now that we're talking the built environment, which is our, vertical and specialty, the urban environment, essentially that you are dealing with 100-year products. The same type of setup is also when you talk about energy, which Rokas is working very much with, right? But then you think of the largest asset classes. It's not as easy as building an app where you don't impact policy, you don't, impact things in such a long time horizon, right? So I think there's also more caution to be had when you're doing it and more thoughtfulness. And I also think that's why science and molecules will be part of the solution, which we've not really worked with in the past, except if you look at healthcare for venture capital.
And there's not much that difference of energy and biotech. It starts with the molecule. And kind of fascinating fact about it, like a lot of people chase the Silicon Valley dream. I mean, the most valuable and profitable company in the world is Aramco. And that's something that a lot of people tend to forget still. I mean, they just made, 160 billion in profits? I mean, it's a fascinating, that is the biggest capital misallocation.
But I think the interesting thing is we find entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley, right? Nova Scotia in Canada, Raleigh Durham in the US, like outside of London, Guildford, like places where you usually don't find those entrepreneurs, right? And I think that's a different journey we're going into. And also with the globalization of venture capital with other regions like the Middle East and so on. And that's going to be really exciting because I think we've seen venture capital being able to actually drive a lot of jobs, productivity, GDP growth, and there's regions in the world that needs that, right?
Part of the efficiency of Silicon Valley is also that everyone who was there building as an entrepreneur was already in a VC mindset. They were there to do that. But when you go out to Guildford, they might have the technology that'll become a VC outcome. But that does not mean that the entrepreneurs are naturally inclined to go on the VC journey. How do you tackle that as climate investors? Because I remember that from my hard tech days, it was definitely not the typical venture profile that you're then approaching with a venture offering, which is definitely not the route for everyone.
You have to respect these founders a lot. They've created some amazing businesses, and it is a transformation to bring in outside capital, right? So some of the things that we try to do is that we try to sit down with the founders and try to onboard them on the kind of new world they're getting into and how you think of growth and runway and these sorts of things to try to bring them along the journey, right? So it's not something which is in the head of the investor, but actually something that is embraced in the board, which becomes a part of the culture in the company and so on. And then I think it's also great that you guys are doing podcasts like this because it helps globalize venture capital, right?
I'll take a slightly different approach to that question. So the sort of comparison that you're trying to do is about Valley has learned their spiel to get accustomed to what the VCs want to hear, right? So they're a type of entrepreneurs that do the right deck, that had the right logos, that had the right universities, that had the right pedigree of experience that they went to do for 3 years. And then they go to build those companies because, frankly, I mean, people can argue and some people hate this, but I mean, SaaS is not that hard if you actually at core understand what each step is required, right? I mean, it's hard when you don't have a problem to solve, but if you have the problem to solve, like to build that business, it's tough, but there is a playbook to it. Let's put it this way. So you just need to go and do a sweat and do the hours, right? When it comes to some of the companies that we back, it's not the playbook is very, very hard. There is a bit of a playbook for the hardware companies. There's a bit of playbook for the hardware-enabled software companies. There's for sure a playbook.
But definitely, it's being written, right?
But it's sort of being written, and it's not as obvious, and will vary significantly even by geography. So, U.S. has, Inflation Reduction Act that by design changes that profile of the playbook, right? So, where I feel a lot of generalists who are trying to go to climate making mistakes is they actually don't understand what they're investing in. And they look for that beautiful presentation and polished guy with like the Berkeley, Stanford, MIT type of pedigree and the Stripe and, whatever the company is that we know that is, the qualifying element of you being successful in life. Actually, these founders are the opposite of that. They come from all the weirdest place, usually scientific community. There is a very, very deep IP, which is very, very complex to understand and requires specific skill set to do due diligence. And you know what triggers me a bit? Like, not a lot of people actually do that due diligence. Not a lot of people ask those tough questions. And I think, for me and Christian, like we go in these discussions, we do ask those questions. And the people that run away are usually the ones that have the pedigree and all that because they don't have the answers. And the people that actually have the IP and knowledge, they enjoy that conversation. They delve into that conversation.
So, and I think that's an important perspective is also that, for example, we actively work with a university that is combined with Aarhus University out of Denmark and Stanford University. And then when I spoke to the head of the center called the CO2 Research Center, and he comes as a professor from Stanford, he actually gave me hope because he said 50% of the new graduates, and I haven't checked the stats myself, out of Stanford actually are interested in doing climate entrepreneurship. So I think
in John Doerr School.
Yeah, exactly.
Climate
like
change.
These sorts of that was before he actually announced that great donation. The great thing about this is that we need to rethink the perspective on Silicon Valley and more thinking of it as an area with an amazing set of ambitions, capabilities, and a muscle that can help solve some of the biggest problems as well, right? Even though they maybe don't have the science and so on. But how do we mobilize them? Because they've tried to be on an entrepreneurial journey before, like some of the serial entrepreneurs. And how do we then bring them into some of these companies to help on that journey? Because the idea might not be invented there, but I think they can be part of the journey as well, right?
And just one thing to add, the mode of Silicon Valley has always been software. This is where they're really good at, and no one can question them on that. This is really, this is unquestionable one statement.
You can discuss semiconductors, whether that's manufacturing.
Sure, that's a fair one. But what is interesting about the climate tech discussion is a lot of that requires a very heavy engineering background. Europe is actually one of the most greatest places, like Switzerland, like Israel, like Denmark, Sweden, even actually Lithuania, where I'm from. The STEM percentage of students that go to do STEM degrees are actually pretty significant. And you look, like countries like Denmark, for example, have built modes around biotech, for example, right? Build a whole industry up there. Like Switzerland, they're one of the best people to manufacture precision type of hardware, or instruments. Like these countries by design have it in their skill for the last 50 years. Or Germany, right? Like Mittelstrasse and all these companies that take one bit, but they do it the best in the world, right? And this is something that is actually required in climate. Those are not quick flips of like 5 years, 100 million ARR, sold it to, Stripe, Google, Microsoft, whatever that is, and move on to the next one. These are like problems that people build for 10 years. And if they do succeed in that, financially, insanely rewarded, but impact-wise, insanely rewarded. Like they are the ones who might actually go and challenge Aramco on, instead of using, jet fuel to fly airplanes, we're going to use sustainable aviation fuel to fly them. Or instead of using gas, we're going to use hydrogen, and that's going to be green. And these are huge transitions that Europe is way more well-positioned to do. Like, again, take Denmark, Vestas, Ørsted. These are two most important companies. Mars, shipping company. Like, US does not have these companies, actually, unfortunately. And the skill set that has been built over the last 30 years to get that skill set to then go and build actually scalable technology business is actually more there than anywhere else. So it's kind of interesting how this shift in dynamic is suddenly becoming so important geopolitically. Suddenly what IRA and Green Deal and countries started to like actually play the game of like, I'm going to be first and I'm going to be first, which is actually also a bit of a distraction because it's a common problem. Like, it's not that we have 7 different planets that we live on, it's one that we live on.
And on that note, climate investing and entrepreneurships is becoming partly security policy. And when you look at it, actually the military, if you think of, now the obligation to spend 2% of your GDP on NATO, then if you look at the military, actually US last year published in February their climate strategy, because if you fundamentally think of it, the military is a huge, contributor to emitting CO2 emissions. So they actually have to decarbonize, right? And they are the largest procurement arm outside of the government.
So in energy, food.
Exactly, real estate, right? So the largest real estate owner in the US is the military. So if you think of this, there's other sectors and industries we need to think of that are
not
in
obvious
touch with,
at all.
with climate.
And it's a lot of these topics that we touch are actually about resilience, right? Like, look at what happened when Russia attacked Ukraine. Like, it's a resilience problem, but it's not just doesn't touch one country; it touches the whole continent suddenly, right? And it's also an inequality problem because suddenly, when your electricity prices increase by 5-fold, the people who actually get touched mostly are the people that don't have the money. It's usually people that barely can survive on their lower salary, and that is where it becomes a problem of equity, a problem of actually who's the most impacted, and then we bail out everyone. But we don't look for like a long-term solutions. And to the point of like everyone doesn't like these days to talk about China, but like China for me is similar to Switzerland actually, which is funny that we're here, is the countries that actually plan for 50 years ahead. And they do actually, contradictory to China, they're all about the volume. This is all about substance.
And Swiss is decentralized cantonals.
And it's very decentralized. It's a very different concept, but the commonality of the two is like they think for the long term. If you look at any country in Europe over the past years, it's all this bullshit political dance that everyone is doing for 4 years, or actually thinking about 2 years, because it takes 1 year to dance to get into the thing. You dance for 2 years and then you dance out of it thing, and then there's another thing. So there's no continuity. And then if there's no continuity on the individual country level, how there's continuity on the continent level? So the people that are debating, which is the biggest probably potential failure, is that if we don't get our act together, because US is a lot of states, but it's still very centrally governed, right?
And that's one of the things I like about being here, right? That we are focusing on creating systemic leadership, because we need to change the system to be able to have, well-functioning society and planet in 100 years from now. And that's where we need to have the discussions. What do we change from how we do things today? Because it's not working.
I think, Rokas, you raise a really interesting point when you say climate and biotech have a lot in common. And if I connect it to the Silicon Valley kind of question, right?
Yeah,
there's also the Boston model that's been working forever, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a matter of it doesn't work. But I leave this, or I will leave this conference with the realization, after 2 years speaking to VCs almost every day, attending the VC Tech conference, we get in this information bubble. And an outcome of being here is just realizing how misunderstood our model still is, right? We've had conversations yesterday together individually, right, where we just see the people around us here, whether they're founders, policymakers, whatever that profile is, many of them don't really understand the venture model, right? And I think that goes to Andreas's point, which in Silicon Valley, hate it or love it, it doesn't really matter. People get it, right? And that is actually a good thing, right? To come back to one of the first questions is, what can we as VCs do here, right? And maybe it's also a good output for our listeners that didn't have the chance to be here today. What are the key takeaways that you take from being here at an event like this? We're only midway through, so it's a bit early to come out with conclusions, but I'd love to challenge you a bit there, which is we all agreed that the potential of ventures is huge, as you started saying off, Christian. But there's something wrong here, right? We're not understood by the counterparties in this conversation.
Venture has, been concentrated to one part of the world very much. Second, it's been a very close community. And I think it's been
exclusive.
driven by, you can say that. It's been driven by the side solutions that have been created and the problems they've been solving. And that's coming back to, we have a different set of problems. So what you're asking is, how do we get everyone as part of that journey? I think the dilemma is that when you look back, there's an South African proverb that one of my good friends always tell me, and I always forget it. But it's something along the lines that it's a small group that's always changed the world, and it will always be like that. And I think that's fundamentally, it's not nice to think of that, right? But that's also how, visionary political leadership has been working, right? That there's a few people who really need to take those decisions and then try to change, right? And
It's almost
and
by
therefore,
definition, being a pioneer is a subset.
exactly.
Of
And then I
operational.
think, so there's, the decision about how the structure in the future should look like, and you should obviously involve as many people as possible. And then the second part of the equation is mobilization, right? How do you mobilize people and to understand them, capital, solutions, and so on. And I think that's really where, when we get to these places for these conferences, we need to bring forward the solutions. So that gives people hope. They start conversations at other places. That creates network effects. We make introductions to others who actually then get the solutions out to work in the world. Because I'm dead tired of going at conferences who are showing the graphs of how bad it's going to be.
Yeah.
Like,
Let's show how
Yeah.
good it could be if that,
because it's not the nurses, it's not the craftsmen who are here, right? Those 10-15% who are attending these conferences, discussing, working with these topics, they already know that we have a challenge. So let's talk about the solutions. Let's talk about how we change policy. Let's talk about how we mobilize capital. Let's talk about how we scale the solutions. And I think that's what we need to really focus on in 2023. And I hope that that's going to be a huge part of the COP28 in UAE.
One thing just to add to sort of your question, the one good thing about venture capital in the context of a discussion of climate worsening is we never look into the past to forecast the future. We rely on it as an indication where this could go, but we always project more when we saw in the past, right? So it's forward-looking always by design. And it's optimistic, it's not pessimistic. So there's not a lot of pessimism, because if you're a venture capitalist who's pessimistic, probably you're in the wrong job. So the second, which is important, is it's all about scale and speed to scale. I mean, there's a book on that, right?
Yeah.
But it's true, right? Like, we're not looking for solutions that can make this city in Villars net zero. We're looking at solutions that can make the continent at to a minimum, but hopefully the world, and can be scaled and can do that fast and capital efficient. So that's another one that is very important, I think. What venture model, like what climate change, worsening, whatever we call it, needs. The third is, for me, I think, by design, if you're, I think, good VC, or, I mean, at least you're defined as being one, you have independent thinking, you are able to pool resources, and you're efficient at doing so, both with capital and your resources. Because, again, every person that is in the industry, Christian, me, and anyone else who's probably listening to this podcast, has 24 hours, of which they probably need to sleep 6. Probably if they have kids, they need 3 hours for their family. And really, frankly, then you have what? You have left something like, what is that? Something like 16 hours of work. And then you have portfolio that you can allocate that time. New portfolio, old portfolio. So it's all about, like, basically trying to figure out where your 1 hour is more efficient, right?
Yeah, and in that regard, I think we need to be humble that VC will play a role, but this is like an ecosystem. It's a societal
It's a
perspective,
capital
right?
stack.
It's a capital stack. It's something where everyone who's also listening to this podcast needs to ask themselves, okay, what's my role and what can I do today? So if you're an entrepreneur in your early stage, okay, you work on getting that, product out there and get the product market fit. If you're a growth investor, maybe it's a little bit more tough times these days, but then you essentially try to figure out how you accelerate the growth of the company, right? And I think that's where you need to look at the whole ecosystem in venture, but also outside of venture, and how do we work together? And that requires that you ask yourself that question every morning and engage. I think that's the key thing.
And the climate tech stack is, like, VC is one of the kind of layers of it, right? Like, you have catalytic capital, we have nonprofit, you have venture debt, you have debt, you have infrastructure. And, like, actually we like, our saying when we talk to LPs is we're, like, optimizing resources to back the technology that becomes infrastructure of tomorrow. Because in this game, where we're actually going from that commodity of choice being oil and gas for 100 years, we built that infrastructure to facilitate that. Yep. We built the grid the old way that it was not suited for the grid that should be now, which is distributed and decentralized. So you actually need to rebuild that infrastructure, or enhance, like, repurpose, whatever you want to call it, right? There's a lot of ways. Some you would need to build as new ones, some will need to repurpose. But what's important there is that probably, like every other company spends 10 to 15% on R&D to build new products, we as a society will spend 10 to 15% to tech, and then the rest will go to infrastructure. That's, like, how I actually think about it. It takes probably $1 to get technology off the ground to what it would take $9 to get that to be built at scale. And that is really, frankly, the $1 trillion opportunity that we're talking. Hundreds of trillions, not billions, it will have to be deployed to build that infrastructure. And it sounds a bit
$94 trillion.
Yeah, and someone listening is like, these guys are just, like, out of whack, But, like, but that's how the world built over the last 100 years. Like, what I would suggest, if you ask for a suggestion for people, just read some freaking history. Like, you will see this has been done before.
Yeah.
At that type of scale that we're talking here. It's just with a bit of different strategy in mind and a bit of different objectives in mind, and they didn't perceive that was going to be a problem. So it is. It is a problem now.
But if you want to think of how you build industries, we discussed this. I think I recommended it to you, Rokas. What's the Netflix series? The Men Who Built America.
Yeah.
It's an old one, but it's really great.
It's really good. It's about Rockefeller. Yeah.
Rockefeller, JP Morgan, like how you build industries, right? And there's also a lot of things which are not nice in that one, but it gives you a perspective.
That was a different bad North Star that they had, but they did well. They execute the strategy very, very well.
I would love to ask you a final question before we end. It's connected to a bunch of quotes that's been said during this interview. Rokas, you said, not glorifying, let's put it like that, that the SaaS business model is no longer practically venture capital because it's so well described. We know the playbook, it's so simple.
No,
I'm putting words in your mouth, but I always do that.
Taking my own medicine.
I'm curious to ask both of you, because I'm seeing that the beautiful thing about venture capital 1.0, if that's what we should term it, right, is that we ended up with that playbook. We made sure that we had a lot of content producers in Silicon Valley that disseminated the VC model as they perceived it needing to be. Right now, I see you two arguing that we need a VC 2.0 or we need a new playbook for climate and hard tech and tough tech. But we also need a playbook, right? Because yes, we need new objectives, yes. But the thing I'm seeing is that, well, could we get to a point where and who is moving on that in writing that playbook that will disseminate the needed knowledge to know how to build these types of solutions and companies and fund them? Because as you said, generalist VCs going into this space tend to go awry, or it can very easily happen at least. So what are you seeing? Are you seeing anyone moving the needle there? You could argue that European VC should actually be leading the charge because, well, we've got the tech, so we should also be the ones supplying the capital.
Just one thing, so just before we go, because I know we'll build on top of this. So I didn't say the SaaS model is bad. I actually love the SaaS model. And there are, like, one of my most successful companies in the portfolio PE case is a SaaS business model that enables the infrastructure to be deployed faster. So there's nothing wrong. It's beautiful businesses, compounding. It's like a very good, but we know the playbook to it. And it's not exclusive to SaaS in enterprise. It's exclusive equally to enterprise SaaS in verticalized, like in But the hardware model is actually where the venture capital originated from. The Eugene Kleiner has built the fundamentals why we are here with the internet where we are. So what we need to do now is to have more Eugene Kleiners to, maybe that's VC 2.0, who are going to build the second generation of VC, and they will do from that same origin where the internet started back in the day, Silicon Valley. So, and I think it's an opportunity for Europe, frankly. And I think if the policy does the right thing and people optimize resources, and I frankly believe, and I actually even know, that playbook will come from Europe.
Yeah, but I also think we need to remember Europe has a good opportunity to create that playbook, right? But I also think that there's a lot of agility in the US as well and other places of the world. So I think it's more about finding a different way of thinking and a different way of operating as a business model. And, you could easily call this podcast, Climate Tech Needs Venture 2.0, right? But I definitely believe in changing that model. And we didn't even go into, return characteristics and risk profile, which I think is a huge part of it, and the capital stack, which we could talk about another day. But I think reinventing the whole way of thinking, but keeping the best from what we learned in the past, I think is the way forward.
So sort of the last point of it, like, can you build a playbook for a hardware company? Absolutely. And to be frank, like what I said, like we are actually doing an experiment now where we're taking like most fascinating companies in the hardware space and hardware-enabled software space and doing basically recalibrating the whole thing back, like what their origin looked like for those companies and what they did right. And apparently, to be honest, there is a lot of commonality among them.
When you look at these industries, they are, under the underlying TAM is so massive. Like the urban environment is the world's largest asset class, right? You have education, you have energy, you have healthcare, which is not really, healthcare has been, around for a time and there's been lots of good disruptions, but it's massive categories that we need to change now. So it's such a different way of thinking as a venture capitalist.
I would love to just end this with a final question, which is, I know you two are pioneers of a project called Climate 50, and I'd love to just ask you to put a few words to that.
Climate 50 is essentially about mobilizing more capital towards climate, and making sure that we enable entrepreneurs to get capital, to have the LPs who invest into GPs mobilize more capital towards these guys, and create a ecosystem where we get closer towards the target of mobilizing $194 trillion by 2050.
And it addresses probably three key stakeholder areas. The reason why we started it was we saw that there's a new climate fund every week basically, and to be honest, there was not much transparency about who are the people and what do they do and what the strategies are. And the reason to come up with this list, or rating we could call it, was that most of the ratings in the world are actually non-transparent, and we actually built something that is published in GitHub as a methodology, and it's backed on data, how these people get ranked, and addresses the fact that founders are one single biggest misuse of time for a founder is fundraising. They could be just building, right? Like they could accelerate that solution, and they have to go raise, and it's not easy to raise actually money, right? Like, and we know it ourselves, right? So this is firstly for the entrepreneurs. Second, it's not for GPs again, even though the rating rates GPs, it's for LPs to learn who are the people, to be understanding where they can deploy. And lastly, it's for GPs to actually understand where they stand.
And if you think of the big perspective, like if we have 10 years left, there's not going to be one single fund that we've seen in the past who owns, the majority of all the returners, right? And therefore we created Climate 50 and our funds to be thought leaders on trying to move forward and show the way, right? And then we can help others grow, and then together, we find the solutions.
And pull more capital to it. Like Larry Fink said, he wants to invest in next 1,000 unicorns. The only way to invest in 1,000 unicorns is probably bet on these 50 funds, which will have 20 companies in the portfolio, and that's your 1,000 companies. And that's frankly what we believe in.
So I think if there's anyone who wants to invest like an endowment or a foundation who's out there, who's listening in, we would be happy to try to give you an overview of how the climate tech landscape is and try to help you mobilize more capital towards that.
And those numbers are shy of 0.1% of their capital deployed. We want to bring that at least to 1%. And if you do that, that is more than climate tech is today in terms of capital.
I think that's the perfect end note for this interview. Rokas, Christian, thanks a million for joining us on the European VC.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you a lot for having us.
Really appreciate what you guys are doing. This is very crucial and necessary.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at EU.VC.